this event, I wanted to tell everybody that we're recording this event. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks in advance for spending your precious Sunday afternoon with us. I'm Shyla Sohoni, and I welcome all of you to this event on behalf of IBPW. IBPW stands for Indian Business and Professional Women. It was founded in 1994. It was primarily a mentoring network to encourage and simulate business and professional potential among women and provide a forum through which members could identify and address issues in the corporate world. IBPW has usually 2 flagship events every year. One of them hasn't happened since COVID, which is the annual mentoring conference. But I think we'll soon be back doing it in the future. But the other flagship event, we have not stopped even once, which is the annual book discussion event in affiliation with Silicon Valley Reads. Silicon Valley Reads came up with the concept that it would be a great intellectual stimulation if the entire Silicon Valley read the same book at the same time, and everybody got together and discussed it at various events. It's organized by the Santa Clara County Office of Education, Santa Clara County Library, and San Jose Public Library Foundation. Each year, Silicon Valley Reads dedicates the entire month of February and March for this event. There are numerous discussions scheduled to take place almost every other day, and this idea has been overwhelmingly popular in Valley. We at IBPW are hosting one of these events today. My name is Shyla Sohoni, and I'm a proud member of IBPW and have been participating in IBPW events over 20 years. I'm an avid reader, and I belong to many book clubs, and I'm an immigrant from India. I'm very excited to be moderating today's event. We have a very special guest with us today, Thrity Umrigar, and it's very timely for the Women's History Month, which is this month. She is the author of 9 novels and 3 picture books. She is a distinguished professor of English at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. She has won many awards for her work. To name a few, she is the winner of the Cleveland Arts Prize, Lambda Literary Award, and the Seth Rosenberg Prize. She is also the recipient of Nieman Fellowship to Harvard. Her second novel, The Space Between Us, was a finalist for the PEN Beyond Marriages Award. These awards and honors recognize Umrigar's significant contributions to literature and her unique voice as a writer. The format of today's event will be a dialogue between Thrity and me. I'll be asking her questions to understand her better, like what motivates her, what challenges her, what are her future goals, etc. If you have any questions for her, please type them in the chat and we'll try to get to them. Thrity, welcome to today's event.
Shyla, thank you so much. I really appreciate being here. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. And it's such a privilege to be chatting with a real author who happened to be from India. And I think we came to this country around the same time. So it kind of makes it even closer to me.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about Sugar in Milk, which is the featured book in Silicon Valley Reads. I simply love that book. I love the way you kind of combined an old legend and you kind of drew a parallel to almost a current situation, somebody coming from a new place, starting everything new. I think it's brilliant, but I don't want to talk about it. It's your book. Would you mind telling the audience a little bit about the book?
No, I think you should talk about my book. I think you'll do a better job than I will talking about my book. It's very difficult for me to talk about my own books, but I'll give it a shot. So as you said, Sugar and Milk is a story within a story, right? So the frame of the story is this new, this child basically, who comes to America. We don't know from what country, but there's a strong indication just based on the illustrations that she is South Asian. And she comes without her parents. She is in the custody of her aunt and uncle. And again, we don't know the reasons why, but she's terribly homesick, and she misses her parents. She misses her cats, Kulfi and Baklava, who, by the way, I had cats by those names because they were very sweet and I wanted to name them. One was a Greek dessert, baklava, and kulfi, for those of you who don't know, is an ice cream of sorts from India. So anyway, so I gave this unknown, unnamed character the names of my old cats. And so she's homesick. And one day her aunt takes her for a walk. And while they're walking, she tells her the story of this legend, which is really the story of how people from Persia, what today we would mostly know as Iran, arrived in India, basically asking for shelter, asking for refuge. And maybe I won't tell you what the legend actually is, because I'm hoping you'll read the book. I'm sure the library has copies. But it's a story about kindness. It's a story about hospitality. It's a story about generosity on the part of the Hindu ruler, who initially has absolutely no intentions of letting these foreigners stay. And then because of an act of really smart thinking on the part of the head of the Zoroastrian refugees, what we today call refugees. Zoroastrian is the religion that these Persians follow. He lets them in, and that's about 1,000 years ago. And those people happen to be my ancestors. So it's a story that I grew up hearing. And the way the story was always told to me, it was that even though the Parsis, as we are known in India, are very much woven into the fabric of India after all these centuries, it's just a story of how to be a kind of model community, and how everybody's sort of mission in life is to sweeten the lives of their communities, much as sugar in milk, adding sugar to milk sweetens the milk. And that sort of goes back to what this legend is all about. As I said, you could have probably told this much better than I did.
Yeah, I mean, I had heard the legend, of course, coming from India. I knew the story, but I love the way you brought it into another story, because,
Yes.
We are all immigrants. Everybody is an immigrant from some
And
point,
I'll tell
right?
you, the story came out, I believe, in 2020. So it was written very much during the Trump years, when the borders were being closed, when walls were being built. And I just woke up one day thinking, what can I do about this? And the answer was very little as an individual citizen, but as a writer, I just thought maybe this old story that I grew up hearing and people like you had heard in your childhood, maybe it has some application to our situation here, because I'm of the great belief that anytime we commit an act of kindness or generosity, both sides benefit from it. I mean, clearly the people who are the receivers benefit from it, but so does the person doing the giving. You smile at somebody at the grocery store and it makes you feel good, and you could change the direction of somebody's day unknowingly, and who better to know this message and sort of internalize this message than kids.
Yeah, excellent. And the illustrations in the book, for anyone who has not seen the book, I really, really urge urge you to get the book and look at it. The illustrations are just beautiful.
They are.
When it's like you're in a dream world. When you're reading the story and the illustrations, they just go hand in hand so well together.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I showed this book to my granddaughter today, and she said, "Is this book for me?" I said, "Yes, it's for you." And she was so
Oh,
excited.
thank you.
Yeah.
That makes me feel so good.
Yeah.
And I should say that I can agree about the illustrations because I had absolutely nothing to do with them. The illustrations were done by this young, brilliantly talented illustrator who lives in Vietnam. So it truly was a global collaboration. And that, of course, is what the theme of the book is, that when disparate people from different backgrounds come together, magic happens, something beautiful grows in the world.
Right.
And I love the fact that the book itself, by its existence, illustrates that message.
Did any of your personal experience kind of reflect in the book when you came in? Whenever.
No, because I came to go to grad school. So I was 21 years old, much older than the protagonist of this story.
Right.
And I had a wonderful first several years in America. I mean, of course, you're homesick and you miss your family. But beyond that, I didn't have the issues that this young girl faces. And I also came for the happiest of reasons. I mean, I came to go to school.
Yeah.
I wasn't escaping something. I was going towards something rather than running away from something, which, as far as immigration goes, makes a big difference. Your reasons for coming make a huge difference in your experience of a new country. So not in that sense, but I have to say that since this was sort of drilled into my head, this legend, this story of how to behave, right? And my ancestors, you could say, were immigrants to India. I was very conscious of that. I was very conscious of how to conduct myself in a new country. And I took very seriously what this book says about what my obligations were to this new country of mine that I today call home, is to give something back. So in that sense, yes, it's a story that I can very much relate to and is sort of loosely based on my life, but not in any practical way.
Okay. How has, you said it's 2020, how has this book been received? I mean, have you heard anything about it? I mean,
I don't know that it has found an enormously large audience, which is a pity. If I can be objective about this book, I think it's a pity because, one, I think the message is going to remain timely, especially in a country like ours, which, one, is a country of immigrants, and two, is a very, very wealthy country that shares a border with a very poor country. So for those reasons, I don't think the issues of people crossing the border illegally or whatever are ever going to go away in our lifetime. They cannot. So I think for that reason, I wish the book had found a wider audience. And two, for the simple reason that you mentioned earlier, the illustrations, again, for which I can take zero credit, are simply wonderful. And I think if people could actually leaf through the pages of this book, I don't know if we can show some of those illustrations right now or not, but it's just,
maybe
here we go. Maybe some other pages like towards the legend itself, so people can see the richness of those. Yeah, I mean, look at that. It's magnificent. The only directions that I gave Koa was, I said, look at miniature Persian art, look at Persian rugs. I want that kind of richness and color and depth in the illustrations. And she just truly nailed it, So for those two reasons, I wish the book had found an even larger audience. But having said that, the people who have read the books and the kids who have read, see, kulfi and baklava right there at the bottom. The people who have read this book absolutely love it, So I can't really complain. I mean, the reception to the book has been wonderful, and it's won a bunch of awards and things like that. So that part is good.
I'm sure this event itself or other events based on this book, which is featured in Silicon Valley Reads, is going to help it too, because people now are aware of this.
Okay.
So yeah, it's going to spread the word. So that'll be nice. So one of the questions I was going to ask you was, when did you decide to become a writer? But then I did read a little bit about you. Now I know the answer. At the age of 15, you published your first
Short story.
article. Yeah. So
Yeah.
do tell us about it. With what motivated you, what brought you into this, and then when did you really become an author and start thinking
Sure.
that way?
So I'll go back even further into my childhood than that. I literally first started writing when I was maybe 4 years old.
Oh wow.
Yeah. And I mean, as soon as I could write, I was thinking in rhyme. I used to write poems all the time. My entire childhood, every evening of my life, we had this wonderful rocking chair on the balcony, and the balcony faced west, so you could see the setting sun. And I wrote in notebooks, throughout my childhood. But of course, the earliest form that my poems took was basically anytime my parents did anything to annoy me, or hurt me in any way, and obviously not on purpose. I mean, they just said, no, you cannot have more ice cream or whatever. I would dash off a poem anonymously, and I would go and put it on their bed when they weren't in the room, and then walk away like, I don't know who wrote that poem. And of course they figured it out every single time, because I couldn't, my handwriting was that of a kid. So I started that. I knew from that early age that the way to think and the way to express my emotions was through writing. I couldn't do it verbally, so it was always through writing. And so by the time I was 15, yes, I did publish my first poem, and I mean my first short story, and it ran in this a national women's magazine called Eve's Weekly. Do you remember that at all?
Yeah.
Eve's Weekly.
Yeah,
It was a big deal. I mean, it was, it had a huge national audience, and I just submitted it, and this was before the internet, so you mailed it basically, and then you never heard anything back. And in India, in certain parts of the city, in Bombay, I should say, they sell like books and magazines and stuff just like on the pavement, on the sidewalk. They'll just put a little rug kind of thing down, and then they'll pile them in. And I remember college had ended for the day, and I was just going by, and I thought, oh, I'll just pick up a copy of Eve's Weekly. And I flipped through it, as you were allowed to do before you bought it. And I saw my name and my story in that, and I had chills all over my body. I mean, till today, that moment was like right there,
Wow.
Yeah. So of course, then I had to scramble, a college student, to see if I had enough money to buy this magazine. And I was very proud of myself. And I went home and I shared it with my family. And we had my dad's unmarried sister lived with us.
Okay.
She read it, and she wouldn't talk to me, because the main character happens to be, a very, very poor blue collar guy who has a drinking problem and all kinds of stuff. And because the story is told from the point of view of the son, his son, she thought I was writing about my dad,
Oh.
her brother. And of course, my dad didn't have a drinking problem. My dad was an upper middle class guy, as different from the character in the story as possible. And yet somehow she made that link or that parallel. And it was my first lesson in the power of storytelling. I mean, at that time, of course, I was stunned and shocked and dismayed and like, what did I do wrong? But that experience really prepared me for, writing can really take you high. You can really get a high, but you better be willing for people, readers, to completely misunderstand at times what your intentions were, and read things. Every reader projects something from his or her own life into what they read. We all do that. And it was a really strong early lesson for me that words have power, and you have to wield them with caution, not caution in the sense that you censor yourself, not at all, but just know that they are going to have an intended impact on people, but they will also very often have an unintended impact on people. So that's how I started, and then I never looked back. And then, again, from much before that, I knew that I wanted to be a writer, but this was, India in the 1970s. I didn't know. I came from a family of, people who worked in banks and offices and had their own businesses. I didn't know anybody who was a writer or an artist or a dancer or in the creative professions. And I knew that if I went around saying I want to be a professional poet, people would just laugh at me, So I did the next best thing. I became a journalist because that would still allow me to have, a life built around words, but it was a more steady job. And that's what I did for a long, long time before I got that fellowship to Harvard that you talked about. And while I was there, I revised what ended up, I did a revision of a draft that I had written while working as a journalist. And I put that draft away for a few years to finish my PhD. And then when I got the Neiman, I would get up very early in the morning and rework that draft. And before I came back to Ohio, I had a book contract.
Which book was that?
It's a book called Bombay Time.
Okay, yeah, that's your first novel. Yeah, right.
Yeah,
right.
my first novel. Yeah.
Yeah, what you were saying, I was going to ask you some of this. You kind of answered the challenges of being an author. So this is the first time I'm really having a face-to-face with an author. So I have so many questions. So when you write, I'm sure your real life experiences, impacting you. It's influencing you. So how do you do that? How do you kind of mask so people don't know who it is? How do you do that? It must be.
Yeah. So, people often think that like something's happens in your life on a Monday and it goes into a book on a Friday. It doesn't work like that. There are times when a story that you've heard that doesn't concern you, it's just a story that you've heard about somebody else that has been told to you a full 20 years prior, and that you've heard and absorbed and then completely forgotten about. But you're writing a book now, let's say in 2023, and you need a backstory for a character. Why does this character behave the way they do? And you remember that story just out of the blue, story you haven't thought about in 20 years. You remember that story. And somehow that story now fits with this character and the backstory of this character. And you give that story to that character. So those are some of the ways, I often say that writers are birds. They're just birds. Birds build their nests by picking up a branch here, a twig here, a leaf here, taking it all back and building a nice nest. That's what writers do, except they don't do it in a finite amount of time. They do it over years. So a story here, a poem here, a life experience here, grief over here, grief over a parrot who has died in 1972. And then you're writing something today.
Wow.
And somehow you draw upon how you felt at that time, that depth of emotion, that well of emotion. You go deep into that. So it's not, you're not writing about a dead parrot, and I'm using the most absurd example I can think of, but you're not then writing about that, but you might be writing about a dead parent instead. And it's, I'm being facetious here. I'm not comparing the two.
This is very, good, very good.
Yeah,
I can totally understand what you're trying to say. Awesome.
But the experience of it, grief is transferable, right? So you would write it differently, of course, but that feeling is the same. The feeling of loss is the same, and you borrow that. So you're stealing from your own life. And, really, most of the time you're stealing from your own life. So when people say, oh, is this book autobiographical? The answer is not really, not in terms of the incidents in the book, but the feeling of the book is, it's like that.
Yeah. This week I did read your book, Space Between Us. I loved it. It's very nice story, very complicated characters and everything. I also noticed that you wrote that book in 2006, and then you wrote a sequel to that in 2018, The Secrets Between Us. I'm very curious to know your experience writing the first book and the second with the time gap. Can you tell us about it?
Yes, it's a very good observation. I cannot believe you actually paid attention to the dates. Nobody does that. So when The Space Between Us came out, it did really, really well. And I immediately started getting mail from readers saying, we want a sequel. We want a sequel. We want to know what happens to Bhima. We want to know what happens to Sarah. I would do book clubs and people would say, well, my book club wrote an extra chapter to the book where we could project what we think happens. And I would be like, wow, I mean, that's more work than I'm willing to do for any author, to be honest with you. So, and when they would ask for a sequel, I was always very polite, but within me, I would say, over my dead body. I mean, why? Why? I have said everything. I from the time I was a child, I was very struck by this. It's not strictly speaking the caste system, but this kind of apartheid, if you will, between middle-class people and the servants who work in their homes. Always fascinated by this very complicated dynamic. I always wanted to write about it, and I was very happy that I got a chance to do that in The Space Between Us. But I felt like everything I'd wanted to say was said. So even to write an extra chapter didn't make sense to me beyond that point, let alone a whole book. So I resisted and I never did. And I wrote other books about other people in the meantime. And then one day, so you're saying the book came out in 18, right?
Yeah.
So let's say it was around 2016 or so. It was just, I was home. I remember that. I was just washing dishes or something, going around, not thinking of my next book or anything like that. And out of the blue, I thought there was this very minor character in The Space Between Us. Her name is Parvati, and she's simply a vegetable vendor at this marketplace where the main character, Bhima, used to shop for groceries. And Parvati, we are told in the original book, you remember that? Yeah. She sells 6 heads of cauliflower a day. That's it. That's her entire inventory. Right. And over the years, I would find myself wondering about Parvati. Why does she only sell 6? How much of a profit can one make? How do you make ends meet if that's the extent of, your inventory, right? I didn't know the answers to that. And in the flash of an eye, one day, I knew Parvati's story. And I mean, I knew it like I knew the opening lines of her chapter. I just knew it. And then I thought, Parvati is the poorest of the poor. Bhima barely makes ends meet. These are 2 women really on the margins of society, both roughly, definitely both middle-aged, one in her 50s, one in her 60s or older. And they're kind of 2 rickety little women. And I just thought, I wonder if they met, if I did the introduction and then got out of the way, I wonder if they would have something interesting to say to each other, to learn from one another, to teach one another. And the instant all these thoughts went through my mind, I knew I could do a sequel. Because now the sequel was something new and fresh. It wasn't just telling the same story twice, which as a writer, I have no interest in doing. I want to tell a new story every time. And so that's why the gap. And that's why the sequel at all. If I hadn't sort of resurrected Parvati, I don't think there would have been a sequel.
I see. Very interesting. So if you were not you, if you were somebody else and looking at the 2 books, do you see a difference now that there's a 12 years gap in when you wrote? Do you yourself see any difference in how you wrote or plot, language or anything?
Yeah, you should do this for a living if you don't already. You are a brilliant questioner, interviewer. You really are. It's a
Thank you.
great follow-up question. So I don't think it comes across that way, but for me, The Space Between Us was always an angry book. I wrote it out of a sense of anger and outrage at how some families in India, too many, if you ask me, treat their servants. It was a young person's book, written with that sense of injustice.
Yeah.
Some people have said, oh, you're airing dirty linen in public. But the point was, I wanted to do that. I wanted people to see, this is how you treat the people who dedicate their whole lives to working in your home, for shame. It was that kind of a book. The other book is not necessarily an angry book. I think it's more, if I'm right about it, I think it's more poetic in some ways. And I have to say that Parvati is probably my most favorite character of any of the characters in, the 9 and soon to be the 10 novels that I've written. She's probably the most well-realized character. I mean, most readers still have a very soft corner in their hearts for Bhima. I mean, when I used to get those letters before the sequel, people used to really write to me and say, I am so worried about Bhima. I can't sleep at night. Could you please write back and tell me what happens to her? And when people would say this to my face during book club conversations or book talks, I would sometimes look at them and say, you do realize that these characters are fictional, right? Like, you can sleep at night. You don't have to worry about Bhima so much, I mean, it was flat.
It only flatters, it only says how realistic you wrote it. We have a person standing in front of us going through what she went through.
No, it's true. It's true. I mean, it was a nice thing for them to say, but I don't want to be responsible for somebody not sleeping at night, But yeah, I mean, I like Bhima as a character, but I love Parvati because she's just this crabby, crotchety old woman with a heart of gold. And I like people like that.
Very interesting. So I know you have written 9 or 10 novels and then 3 children's books. What's your, do you like to write one better than the other? Is writing one kind of book makes you happier? How do you tell us?
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, I only write one book at a time. I have a few friends who will work on multiple books at a time. And I just don't have the bandwidth for that because I like to go, when I'm writing a book, I'm really lost in that world. Like I can function well enough. I have a day job, I teach, I see my friends, I have a full, well-rounded life. But some part of me is always distracted when I'm really into a book. I could be watching TV or a movie that somebody else has made, but what I'm really doing is I'm thinking about my own work, I forgot your question. Why am I saying all this? What was your question?
No, between children's book and others book.
Oh, between children's. Oh, I love writing picture books. I mean, for one thing, it's a lot less commitment of time, right? My first ever picture book, which was just several years ago, was called When I Carried You in My Belly. And I wrote that on a plane flight, a 45-minute flight that was a very rickety, bumpy flight. And in order to calm my nerves, I used one of those United Airlines napkins, and I wrote out the whole book on that napkin. By the time the plane landed, I had my first children's book, So that's fun for me. And again, my background, my writing life started by me writing poetry, which I don't write professionally anymore. So picture books are the closest that I can come to following the rules of poetry rather than prose, because a good picture book has rhythm, has a kind of tune to it, has a kind of music to it, like a good poem does. And so, yeah, I love writing picture books.
When my granddaughter was born 4 years back, I wanted to write a book for her. And my daughter said she was going to illustrate, but I haven't done that yet. So someday.
Oh, you didn't write it at all?
No, not yet.
Well, it's early in California. I think you should write it tonight.
Vienna with
There's,
a napkin. Okay, maybe we'll do that.
there's no excuse. You should do it. And then you should send me an email telling me you've written your
I
first
will do
children's
that.
book.
I will definitely
Yeah.
do that.
No, it would be such a great gift to give her. Think about it. Yeah.
Yes. So do you get writer's blocks? A block, I guess. What do you do? How do you get over it?
I don't believe in it. I
Okay.
just maybe that's a kind of superstition, but I just refuse to believe in it. And I'm hoping that if I refuse to believe in it, it's like monsters under the bed.
Yeah.
If you don't believe in them, then they don't exist.
So you came to this country, I guess it's in the 83. I came in 82. And those days, at least maybe wherever, depending on where you were, it was, I mean, coming from another country was not the easiest thing. People didn't know much about India.
Yeah.
They even somebody asked me, do people go on elephants and such? So how was your experience? Have you reflected that kind of experience in a book? I know you already told me you had a great experience because you came here to study, which I did too. So that's a different thing, but still, depending on where you end up, you
Yeah.
could be a kind of stranger. So it's much easier now though, because of internet and everything, people know where
Yeah.
you are.
Yeah.
So.
And did you come directly to California?
No, I went to Baton Rouge.
Where were you before?
Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Oh, in Baton.
Yeah.
Okay.
People
Okay.
didn't know
Okay.
much about India.
Yeah. Yeah.
But coming as a student had its own perks and
Yeah. So my experience was a little different. And I think it was different because I went to a really big public university. I went to Ohio State.
I
So
see.
there were a lot of international students. I mean, I'm sure nowhere near the numbers today.
Yeah.
But there were just enough. I mean, not so many in the humanities. I studied journalism at Ohio State. So not so many in the humanities, but like in the hard sciences, like in physics and all that, there were tons of Indian students on campus. So I didn't really have those kinds of experiences or encounters. And in fact, what I had was the opposite. I mean, I had people really opening up their homes and lives. I didn't have a car, so I used to take public transportation to go to the grocery store. And I remember, like, you would sit next to a stranger, and the grocery store was just like 3 or 4 stops, right? It wasn't that far. And people would just like tell you their life story. And, in India, you didn't do that. We were all quite reserved. Like even with close friends, you didn't just share intimate details of your life. And I used to think to myself, what kind of a country have I come to where people are so free and so open with like what they share with you about their most private details, and part of me was scandalized by that. And part of me was totally charmed. And I thought, why not? I mean, that's not a bad way to be. So yeah, no, I've often said, that if my first 2 or 3 years had not been as charmed as they were, I would have probably just gone back home. But I had a great time. Yeah.
So what is next, Thrity? What projects are you working on? What is next?
Yeah, so I'm just finishing a book that's going to come out in September.
Okay.
So this is probably the last edit that I'm doing. It's a novel. It's called The Museum of Failures. I told a friend of mine the title last evening, and we'd been drinking a little bit. So she misheard it as The Musical of Failures. And I'm now feeling the pressure. Maybe I'll write a children's book called The Musical of Failures or some such, but it's called The Museum of Failures. And it's a very different book than my last book, Honor. Honor was a very sort of political book. This is more intimate. This is more like a family story. And it's the story of a mother and adult son who are pretty estranged from each other. The son lives in the US and he goes back to India for a different reason. But while he's there, he hasn't visited his mom in over 3 years. And while he's there, he realizes that she's been hospitalized. So he goes there and finds that, there are feelings that he still has for her, despite all the unpleasantness of the past. And then he stumbles upon a family secret that really makes him reevaluate, not just his relationship with her, but really his life,
Well, can't wait to read the book. Yeah.
Thank you.
And as I said, I'm part of a couple of book clubs. Do you, if requested, if the time permits, would you kind of come attend the book clubs?
I used to do quite a few of those.
Okay.
There are too many requests now. So at least for the next 6 months or so, I'm totally taking a break from that.
All right. Are there any questions from the audience? We are coming to.
Yeah, it looks like.
There's
oh, wow, there's quite a few. Let's see.
Yeah, let me quickly see if it is anything. I think somebody asked about your next project. So while I'm looking for the questions, I want to tell you that when I was reading The Space Between Us, I kept thinking, are you in any of those characters that you're portraying? The only thing that came kind of close to my was probably Dinaz.
True. True. I was Dinaz. Yeah.
Yeah. I thought so because
yeah.
First of all, she's the sweetest character in the whole book, and
she's what?
She's the sweetest character in the book.
Oh.
I mean, and the experiences of the servants and how, I mean, we had the same experience. I have probably kind of fought with my mom. Why do you want to keep a glass separate for them? Why can't they use the same glass? But it's like it takes time to get used to the different things.
Yeah.
Like those experiences.
Yeah. I should also say that I don't know when, there's no release date for it, but I have finished another children's book called Maya's Holi, the holiday Holi, because I have a book called Binny's Diwali.
Diwali, yes.
Yeah, and now I'm doing another book for Scholastic called Maya's Holi. So I've just started seeing the rough sketches for it, and it looks really great.
Okay.
But that won't be for a year or two.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Nice. Very nice. All right. Deepika, read any questions that we need to address here in the panel?
Somebody is complimenting you, saying Shyla has been a brilliant questioner. So.
Thrity, I had a question that I wanted to ask you. I love it's Reed. I don't know if you can see me. I put my camera on.
I can see you, Reed.
Okay, I can see you too. I love the depth of all your books. Like every single book that you have seems to address something that's either happening in our culture or in our society or personally. And even your kids' books like addresses something kind of on a deep level. And I'm just wondering if it helps you work through personal conflict or things that you're thinking through to write these books.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as I was saying, my earliest experiences with writing were just purely, they were not intellectual exercises, those anonymous poems that I wrote to my parents. They were an emotional response to something or the other that was bothering me. And it strikes me that in some ways, my reasons for writing have not changed all that much. I mean, I still write mostly to weigh in on a certain issue, as Reed said, that is either prevalent in the culture or something that's on my mind, but two, to also sort of seek out and figure out how I actually feel about this issue, not just at an intellectual level, but at a very deep personal level. So writing really does help me in those ways.
It's like therapy. I love it.
In a way, and people always say that every book begins with a question, and what the writer is trying to do in the course of writing the book is to answer that question. And I think that's true to a very large extent.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all of your amazing events that you've done with us, Thrity. Really appreciate you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thrity, if somebody says that I only have time for one book, which of your book do you recommend?
Oh, that's not fair. Come on.
No, which of your book is your favorite?
What I would say is, why do you have time for just one book?
That's true. That's a good answer.
No. Okay. So I mean, you always feel closest to the book that you've done most recently, I suppose, in some ways, So I would say honor the book that came out last year. It's a very timely book it's
I
about a
read,
timeless
read
issue.
about it. Yes, I read
Yeah.
about it, and yeah, it's very timely.
Yeah.
Considering what's happening in India every day. So
And everywhere, really. I mean, honor killings and just prejudice and bigotry. I mean, what country is truly, the details change from one culture to another, but the underlying sexism, misogyny, I mean, that's the same.
yeah, I agree. All right, I think we are 45 minutes is up. I had a great time talking to you, Thrity.
Oh my God, pleasure was all mine. Again, you really, I mean, I think I'm just going to applaud you on the quality of these questions. You did a superb job. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and hope to be in touch with you.
All right, and everybody put some pressure on her so that she writes that book for her grandchild.
Thank you. I will do that.
Not grandchild, sorry, for your daughter, right?
Granddaughter.
Oh, it is your granddaughter.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, my
okay.
daughter would illustrate that in the book. Yeah, she's
Okay.
an
Okay.
artist. So that's my goal. Yes, I will do that.
And you will do it tonight.
No, I will.
Okay. Write the first page tonight. How's that?
Alrighty. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Thank you, Thrity.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. This was
Bye.
great. Really.